Welcome, everyone, to the basic introduction to NEMSIS data elements, datasets, and schematrons training session, which will be presented by Jennifer Correa and Lauri Lunde, both members of the NEMSIS TAC. This training is geared towards those who want to gain a better understanding of NEMSIS and its components. The session will cover the data dictionary and various types of elements within it, as well as the datasets, how the datasets are used in the NEMSIS standard. Participants are also going to get an introduction to schematron and the national and state schematrons and how they work together. This session is being recorded, and we will be posting it to YouTube when it's done, so you can watch it at your convenience or rewatch or share with a colleague. The presentation is designed to be a conversation, so participants, you are encouraged to come off of mute, ask your questions, or post the questions in the chat. I will be monitoring that, and we'll bring it up to the presenters as they come in. So thank you very much for this. I think that's all we need for the introduction. We hope you enjoy the training, and I'd like to turn the time over to Lauri.
Sounds great. Thanks, Chris. And Jen and I do plan to kind of tag team today. So she'll be doing a lot of the presenting, but I plan to kind of jump in and ask questions or throw in information as well. And I just want to say welcome. I noticed I looked at the list of participants here. We have a great turnout, and I recognize there's a lot of brand new state data managers on that I've been meeting with and helping to bring them up to speed on all things NEMSIS. And so we're glad you're here today. And there's also lots of seasoned veterans. And I'd say if you want to jump in and share anything you think would be helpful or questions anyone has, as Chris said, please interrupt us or put a question in chat. And Chris is going to kind of watch those and ask them for you. And feel free to push the button to raise your hand too. We'll try to do our best to keep everyone engaged and answer your questions as we go or at the end. Either way is fine. And I'm going to pass it over to my friend and colleague, Jen Correa now. She really is the expert on all things schematron and elements and data sets. And so I asked her to help lead this training today. So I'll pass it to you, Jen.
Thanks, Lauri. I don't know that I would use the word expert, but I have definitely been learning over all of these years working with Laurel, who has recently left us, with Josh. And I remember what it was like when I first started and trying to figure out how everything worked together and how it went. So thank you for taking the time to join us, everyone. If you have questions, please do not hesitate to ask. If you have the question, someone else probably has the question too. And again, if you don't want to ask your question or you want to store them up until the end, that's fine. Or if you'd really like to have some one-on-one time, please feel free to email Lauri or myself, and we can get that scheduled as well. So like we said, this is going to be basics. There may be some of it that is repetitive or that you've heard before for some of you, and for others, it may be new. One of the terms that gets thrown around a lot is XML, and that's the extensible markup language. And so the easiest way to think of it is this is the format that the file is in, right? So when we receive an EPCR from your state system to the national data repository, it comes in XML. Or if the EPCR software that is created comes to your state system, it's in XML format. So that's just the easiest way to think of it. Very rarely will you hear someone say extensible markup language, but that is what XML stands for. The other one that there's oftentimes confusion about is attributes. And the best way I can describe an attribute is it just adds value to the information within the element. So for example, the pertinent negatives are not values, right? Those are attributes. So you have an element that accepts a pertinent negative. It could be a pertinent negative all by itself, patient refused, right? Or it could be a pertinent negative that adds information to the exam section, for example, anything like that. So there's different ways that an attribute can be applied to an element that just adds value to the information within that element. Other descriptors could be the type of code that is used, right? Is the medication a SNOMED CT code, or is it an RX norm code? If we're talking about mileage, are we talking about miles or are we talking about kilometers? Those kinds of descriptions. The other thing that gets talked about and asked about quite a bit is the different types of software, receive and process versus collect and send. The way I like to think about it is receive and process, that is your state level software. So that software is receiving ePCRs and processing ePCRs to go to the various places that it goes. Collect and send, that's where an ePCR is created and then sent on to the state or local level. The data dictionary, which we're going to go over in quite a bit of detail, that contains information on each of the NEMSIS elements. There's also a lot of additional information within the data dictionary. And it's really, really helpful to get very familiar with your data dictionary, especially for the NEMSIS standard. Some states have created their own data dictionary that can be helpful for their agencies as well. We do have an infographic that is available. We will show you where later on the usage and guides page on the NEMSIS tab that shows you the simple differences between this receive and process and the collect and send software versions. So you can see here on the state level, it does not create an ePCR. These are your state and regional products. It receives the ePCR XML from collect and send software. And the compliance is very similar, but different, the compliance process that it has to go through. And collect and send creates the ePCR. This is what the field level products are. This is where your EMS clinicians are entering the data. And they're tested for compliance on the ability to collect the information. So that's a pretty simple way to look at it, but that's the easiest way I can think of to explain the difference between the two. And then that takes us to the data dictionary, which I will say one of the things I like to do in my old position when I had to be very, very familiar with everything involving an element for each state. I actually had a data dictionary printed out that I kept on my desk with lots of notes for all of the different states. You can do it electronically now. I'm kind of a tactile person who likes to print things out. But this can be a really good tool, especially as a data manager, to have to reference. The other part is that you want to know what's in each of the elements within the data dictionary. And this data dictionary reference page is located before the table of contents in pages II through VII. And each of these green numbers will correspond to the definition for that header in the element. And it is super, super helpful to know how to read the data dictionary. I like the fact that they put in some nice bright colors to let you know if it's a state element or a national element or both, as in the case of the example here. And this tells you yes or no for the national state element in this part as well. It also, for those of us who have been around a while, lets you know if there was a version 2 element equivalent to that. That can be helpful for people who were around when we had the version 2. Usage and recurrence, we're going to talk about in depth in a minute. Then it also lets you know pertinent negatives, not value, is nillable. Is nillable is not the same as leaving something out of the XML. Is nillable is actually a value within the XML. So this actually will explain in great detail. If you take nothing away from this data dictionary reference page, take away the usage and the recurrence. You will hear that a lot as you work with the NEMSIS data. So for the recurrence, you can have 0 to 1, 0 to many, 1 to 1, 1 to many. You'll hear that a lot. This just tells you how often you may see that element within an XML, right? So how many times or how many values can a clinician put into the PCR, a type of service requested? Just one. It's a mandatory element. They can only have one value, right? So it's going to be a 1-to-1. It's required and can only occur once. But 1-to-many, you could have something that's required, but it can have multiple values in it. So recurrence is very important. And when you start to look at the rules and you start to look at how you want to set things up, this also comes into play, as well as the usage. So mandatory, it must be completed. There's always going to be a valid value, right? There are no not values or anything allowed for a mandatory element. That sometimes can get confused with the required elements, which need to be completed, but it could be completed with a not value, right? The crew could select not applicable, or the software could populate it with not recorded. So, and then you have the recommended and optional, which do not need to be completed. Recommended allows for not values and optional does not. So Lauri's going to take us and show us the data dictionary, where it can be found on the NEMSIS website.
Thanks, Jen. And I'll just repeat what you shared there, that probably one of the most common questions I often get is, what's the difference between required and mandatory? People will email me that and ask. And so it's good to know where to find that. And can you guys see my screen here? The NEMSIS state page? Perfect.
Yes, ma'am.
If you come to the technical resources tab, and under there, if you look on the left-hand column, the second tab down, it says data dictionaries and XSD. And this is where you can find our data dictionaries. Currently, the version 3.5 is listed on the top of this page. And if you scroll down, you can find the version 3.4. And I do want to point out as well that this was just recently updated. This critical patch 4 came out in the last few weeks. So as Jen mentioned, if you have a hard copy or a saved PDF somewhere on your desktop, know that it's probably outdated. It's not the most current version. So you may want to download a new one. And I also put links to these in the chat just a few moments ago, so you can click on it and download it there. And there are some advantages to the PDF version if you prefer that, or if you prefer the web version. I know Jen likes the PDF. I really like the web version. I like to be able to click on things and open it quickly rather than scrolling down or navigating to a page or a section. But as Jen mentioned, that on the left here is kind of a table of contents. And the second tab here on the left, there's an overview with some numbers, and then this summary and sample element page. That's what Jen was just showing you. So let me click on there. And you can see the little green numbers here next to each title or definition. And if you scroll down, that corresponds with a number, a green number on this chart. So it'll tell you more about it there. And then the information Jen was pointing out, the mandatory required is listed right here, not values being accepted, the recurrence, all of that information can be found here in the data dictionary. And then just a reminder too, if you click on a specific element, this is in the EMSDataSet, as you click on it, it'll give you all of this information. This is where you can find this for each of the elements. All right, I'll pass it back to you, Jen. Any questions on data dictionary or finding things in it? Most current versions. Okay, back to you, Jen. Oh, did we have a question?
Yes, I did. This is Dipti Patel from state of Georgia.
Hi, Dipti.
Hi, I do have a question about the data dictionary, and I believe it's called the NEMSIS validation rules, and I just wanted to have a better understanding of what that exactly means.
Are you asking about in the data dictionary?
Yes.
Okay, so most of the
it's under the associated validation rules section towards the bottom of the page.
Oh, okay, yes. So in version 3.5, one of the really, which I thought was super helpful additions to the version 3.5 data dictionary, was the associated rules with that element are listed at the bottom of each element's page. And so that lets you know from the national schematron which rules could be applied to that element. Some of the rules are, and I know that there's a term for it. I'm not sure what the technical term is, but there'll be a rule there that says, you know, if applicable, this is looking to see if it has a not value and any other associated value, right? There's a list of elements where that is not allowed to happen. You cannot have a not value and a valid value. And so that will be listed at the bottom. And so I know sometimes that rule, in fact, let me reopen the data dictionary really quick.
Hey, Jen, can I ask a quick question on this topic?
Absolutely.
Is there a way to download those validation rules that's not in XML format? Just to look at them all in one place?
Do you mean like in a spreadsheet or
Right.
PDF type of format?
Yeah.
You know, I am not sure. Hang on, let me do a new share. I just realized that I was not sharing what I thought it was. Go. I was moving around on this page and you guys couldn't see me moving around. So this one here, NEMSIS Schematron E001, right? This rule is applied to multiple elements throughout the data dictionary. And so when in, or not this one. Actually, it's written a little different. I shouldn't have gone there. Sorry. That's what I get for going to the top. Here we go. So you'll notice that when this error is written, the name of the element is inserted into the message, but it's the same rule ID. So that error, that the way it is written, it looks for that element. It looks to see if there's a not value of not applicable, not recorded, or not reporting, if allowed for the element. So if this rule fires, it might not be looking for not values because those aren't allowed for the element. Maybe it's looking for the pertinent negatives if allowed for the element. So it's real important to know about that message within the data dictionary, because I know that one has I've gotten a few questions on that over the last couple of months.
This is Lauren from Zoll. Do you foresee the states being able to do something similar as well with their custom elements?
With custom elements, I'm not sure. I don't know what resources the states are going to put out for their custom elements. I'm not sure. And then I know there was a question about the availability of the national schematron in a format other than XML, and I will check into that and find out if there is. And then I believe Josh is on the phone, so if he knows the answer and just wants to say it, that would be fine too.
Yeah, Jen, if you could go to the website, go to the technical resources menu and then schematron.
Do that.
Do you want me to do that, Jen? Oh, you've got your.
Technical resources, which page?
Schematron.
Okay.
Yeah, and then click on either the demographic or EMS or state, either of those first three links. No, back the first three links. Yeah, and then go to the overview by validation message. It's the first thing on the left. There's the list of all the rules. So if someone wants to do something with those, you can just highlight those and copy paste them into Excel or wherever you want.
That's awesome. Thank you. I didn't realize it was under that, listed under that.
Well, I did not either, Ella. So I learned something new today too. And so see, there is always something to learn. So
Good question, Ella. And this is just a good time to say, like, if you have a question, probably others do on the call as well. And so please jump in and ask, and it'll help us all learn together.
Yes. And then I will also make a note, and maybe we can add that to the PowerPoint as well, where that can be found, because that would be helpful.
Yeah.
So just some quick facts about national elements. These elements are the only elements that are sent to the National Data Repository. National elements are the only ones that come to the NEMSIS TAC, right? There are a total of 213 national elements. Not all of them will be collected and sent in an EPCR. There's only 144 national elements in the EMS data set, right? And not all of those are applicable to every single call. So there are also state element quick facts, and these elements are sent to the local state level through collect and send as well. State elements do include all of the national elements, right? So there isn't a national element that's not also a state element. And there are 327 state elements to choose from. 217 are in the EMS data set. That's the EPCR that's created. And what about when it's not national or state? Those are the recommended and optional elements, right? So they can be sent to the local state level. A state can add any recommended or optional element to their state data set that they would like to collect. These elements are not sent to NEMSIS, and there are a total of 313 elements, 224 of them in the EMS data set that are recommended or optional. And you're going to hear this again later, but I don't think it can be said enough. Knowing that the recommended elements allow not values and the optional elements do not allow for not values is super important when you're thinking about the schematron rules that you're going to start making. So you're going to hear more about that later, but that's super important to know. Custom elements are the other type of elements that's included. And this was something that was added.
Can I interrupt? Sorry, Jen, can I interrupt real quick on that last slide? I was going to say, I know as a lot of states right now are going through the version 3.5 transition, we're really encouraging you to take this time to kind of review what elements you're collecting on a state level. If you have a committee you can take it to, or a state medical director, or state epidemiologist, or anyone you may want to get feedback from, or maybe look at what other states are collecting and just say, are we collecting what we want, what's helpful to us, or the things we want to add or drop? And just a reminder too, that these state only elements are not coming to us. And so it really is up to you to decide what you want to collect.
That is a great point. And in version 3, we added custom elements. That's something the states really wanted. They wanted the ability to collect more information than what was in the NEMSIS standard and have the ability to get it at the local or state level. Custom elements do not get sent to the National Data Repository. They do not come to the TAC. They're designed by the state EMS data managers. They may also be some national custom elements that are designed usually in conjunction with our stakeholders. And you saw a really good example of that with COVID, when we needed to come up with the dates of travel and where someone may have traveled to, and we needed them quickly in the EMS world, in the EMS environment. And so those became national custom elements. There is some guidance on creating custom elements on the guides and usage page. And you'll hear this a lot too. When you're creating or thinking about creating custom elements, consider the impact on your EMS provider agencies, consider the impact on your vendors, and know that it's not just flipping a switch or overnight or anything like that, that it is going to take a little bit of time. Custom elements can be created for any of the NEMSIS data sets. So that's EMS or demographic. There's just Lauri, do you want to go ahead and show them the custom element checklist?
Sure. Yeah.
And that.
Yeah, let me share again here.
So on the guides and usage page that Lauri is going to take you to, you'll see some documents for custom element creation.
So under technical resources, the left-hand column, the bottom one, guides and usages, if you click there, and then it's the second section here, there's a custom element toolkit, we call it. And there's several things. I'd encourage you to download this guide and read through it if you're considering adding some custom elements to your state. This checklist is very helpful as well. And one of the first questions to ask is there a need for this custom element? Is it already created perhaps by another state that you could share that custom element with them or try to collect the data in a similar way. Really the goal as we're adding new elements is we want to make it as similar as possible across the states. And so we want to be able to create benchmarks and compare data and that kind of thing. So the first question is, has it already been created somewhere else? And we can help you determine that. Your software vendor can help you determine that as well. But this is a great checklist of different steps in the process, kind of who's responsible for different steps. And then there also is, let me go back a page here. There's also some other resources, a flowchart and approaches to using custom elements. I'd encourage you to look at that as well. And then, do you want me to show the custom element library as well, Jen, while we're here?
Yeah, you know what, since we're here, let's go ahead and show them that.
Okay, so under technical resources again, just below the dictionary tab, there's a national custom element library. And this will show you custom elements that have been created by other states, and there's ways to search. Let me mention here, I know we said as the data dictionary was updated recently for critical patch 4, some of you, maybe that's new information or you're wondering what was involved in that critical patch. This document right here can show you that information of what has changed with critical patch 4 and the changes that were made in each of the elements there. So I wanted to point out that while we were near it here. But the custom element library is this tab right here. And you can search keywords or search for a state. But for example, there's recently or commonly searched terms, I should say, listed below. So if I click on trauma, for example, it'll show 18 custom elements related to trauma. And underneath the title here in bold, it'll show you which state or which states, if there's several states that have adopted that custom element. And then it shows also if it's a national custom element. Do you want to explain, Jen, a little bit the difference between national custom element and a state custom element?
So a national custom element has been developed in the hopes that everyone will implement it exactly the same. And what that enables us to do is, or for you to do, is to collect the data in exactly the same way, create benchmarks, be able to do comparisons across the states. If you do it differently, the custom element may not be shown as the same, right? So for example, here, this affects the e-injury 03. And you saw on the page before that there were a couple other states that had previously done e-injury 03 elements, and each one was listed separately. They could be collecting the exact same information, but because the definition was slightly different, or there was a comma, or they made the field recommended instead of optional, that's going to show the custom element separately as not the same. So the national custom elements are being developed in the hopes that all of the states will implement them exactly the same way, so that it's easier for you to compare data. Because if you're collecting data differently from one state to the next, it's hard to do comparisons between the two.
Sounds good. Thanks, Jen.
Lauri and Jen, we have a post in the chat from Ann Vosbrink. I wanted to read this real quick. So Ann writes, in my experience, it is also harder to ensure agencies understand that they need to be adding them to their respective ePCRs and that they need to make sure they are exported as part of the XML file to the state repository than with a NEMSIS data element. Even optional elements in NEMSIS's data dictionary are easier to use uniformly across vendors and agencies.
That's a really good point. It does. Keeping it consistent will make it easier for the agencies and also your software vendors to implement as well, because they're not having to look for all of the differences. So that is pretty much the part where we're going to discuss the elements, the difference between the elements. And now we're going to start talking about the NEMSIS datasets. That's a term you're going to hear a lot.
Sorry, Jen, can I interrupt you again?
Oh,
Lauren's got a
absolutely.
good question here related to the custom element library. She says, for example, if you look at eHistory 902 and 904 for Oregon and the national one, they look the same. And so that looks like recent travel locations.
Yeah, so when I was looking at the custom element builds for Oregon, I did see that some of them do look pretty similar, but they're listed separately. So I was just wondering if we could just take a look at one of those while we were together.
We can.
Do you want me to share my screen, Jen? I've got it pulled up.
Could you
Looks
please?
similar, but not exactly the same. It looks like the definition's a little different between this national and the Montana.
And that right
Possibly.
there is enough. It could be
Yeah.
exactly the same within the element itself. But if that description that's inside the custom element configuration section is different, it's going to show separately. So that when I say exactly, I mean down to the period, the spaces, the commas, within the description, the definition, and the choices that are within those custom elements. If you click on, do me a favor, click on eHistory 901, the recent travel, and bring up the way it'll, click on that one. So all of the information that's down below, as far as the codes and the descriptions and the pertinent negatives and optional, all of that could be exactly the same. But because that definition was different, it shows up different in the custom library. So that, I know I'm harping on that a little bit, but that's one of the reasons why the national custom elements on some things are being created, trying to encourage the use of the same exact item across the board. Did that answer the question okay?
Yes, thank you.
Jen, we have a couple other comments in the chat here. I'd like to bring up Venkat has written custom elements are based on state, but during active testing for certification, we will get the test files from a different state, and we are forced to add them to the custom elements to get software compliance.
Yes, so custom elements are a part of the compliance process. We do try to use existing custom elements. And we do our best to make it so that there's no extra development required. And that's, we hope to use national custom elements in the future.
Gotcha. And then Anne has a follow-up to her previous comment here where she said, with the example of the updates to ENDRI 03 and 04 as a national custom element, will the data element be accepted by NEMSIS, sent to NEMSIS, or still just the agency to state, and then mapped to the current non-custom versions of ENDRI 03 and ENDRI 04?
Okay, so I think I caught all of that. So if your state is still collecting data in version 3.4, you would be getting that information in custom elements. Okay, so that custom elements do not come to the NEMSIS, the National Data Repository. If your state is collecting in version 3.5 and you've updated to critical patch 4, then you could send the data in that format within NEMSIS 3.5. And Anne, let me know if I missed any part of the answer that you needed.
Hey, Jen, you did not miss it actually at all. And I'm learning so much from this, even though I've done this job for like 10 years. And one of the things, I always learn something new and I'm like, oh, I didn't know that. To me, I'm familiar with custom elements, but national custom elements are just something new to me. And I don't think I understand them as well as I should. And a question kind of adding on to that. So if it's a national custom element, does that mean that the expectation would be that everyone would build it the same, like you said, but that we would be able to send that custom version to NEMSIS? Or is that only when there's a critical patch for a national custom element?
So as of now, the National Data Repository does not get any custom element, including the national custom elements. But when we go to start doing the review for the next versions, national custom elements and how often they're being utilized by the states will play a big part in whether those elements become a new part of the standard. And so that would allow you to continue to compare the data you collected while it was a custom element to the data you got once it became a part of the national data standard. So that it just helps. And it also helps for not just the historical part of it, but especially if you're in a regional area where you want to do regional comparisons, that really does help when everybody's doing it the same way. And from a vendor perspective, if all of the element is the same and there's still development time, but it's easier, right? Because you know what the expectation is. It's already developed. There's not as much go back and forth as if you're trying to create it from scratch.
But with the new ENGRIO 3 and ENGRIO 4 that are national custom elements, where there'll be the patch, those will have the new values, for example, that weren't in the 3.5 data dictionary when it first came out. Those will actually get sent to NEMSIS now. That's the idea, right? With the critical patch.
Yes, if it's collected in the version 3.5 critical patch 4, yes.
And is this something where, because that's something else with custom elements, is because they're not normally sent. Is this something where NEMSIS at some point will expect that people in 3.5, vendors, agencies, states, whatever, are collecting ENGRIO 3 and 4 in the new format and will stop accepting the old format? Or am I getting out of scope that question?
No, so no, that's a good question, because so it's now a part of the NEMSIS standard. So when we go to, let's say 3.5.1, assuming that there's no ACS revision, right? Which I don't think there would be, but it'll still be existing in 3.5.1. So if you're collecting it in version 3.5 utilizing the critical patch, there would be no change in 3.5.1. If you're collecting it using the custom elements for 3.4, or you're collecting it in 3.5, but you're not in the most recent version of 3.5, so you're using the custom elements, those custom elements will not be sent to the NEMSIS TAC. So you wouldn't be able to see them in the National Data Repository, but you would get them at the state level.
For the critical patch, just for vendors, do we have to wait till all of the states then turn it on their side in order to be able to submit it?
I don't think I get what you mean, Lauren. Are you asking, so you can utilize it with custom elements? So if you have an agency, let's say you're in a state that's in 3.5, but they haven't loaded the critical patch for 3.5, and your agency wants to collect the ACS triage criteria, you can use those custom elements in version 3.5 to collect that for your agency. And when you send to the state, you would just need to make sure you send it to the state in the format the state expects.
Okay.
And this is Josh. I wanted to just add a little perspective on these triage custom elements. The expectation was that the custom elements would be published, and then several months later, the critical patch would finally be ready and published, and then the custom elements would become, unnecessary after the critical patch. It turned out that the critical patch was actually released, I think, just 2 or 3 weeks after the custom elements were published. And so once you're on the latest critical patch of 3.5, the custom elements for those 2 elements just don't apply anymore. They'll be standard values within the latest critical patch of 3.5. So I think that was maybe a little confusing, just how quickly the 2 followed each other.
As I said, we beat expectations, so that's a good thing. We can talk more about the critical patch and the triage criteria and the custom elements, but I know we have a little bit more to get through. So if you do have more questions, please send them in, put them in the chat. Chris will make sure we get copies of all those questions, and we'll make sure your questions get answered. But I want to go to the NEMSIS DataSets. and talk a little bit about that as well. And we still have the schematron part to get to after this. So I'm going to talk a little bit faster through the data set part. That doesn't mean I don't want questions. Please ask if you have them. This is the NEMSIS datasets. You'll hear that a lot. There are 3 datasets. Those are subsets, right? That make up the NEMSIS standard. So you have your state data set. This is supplied by your state EMS data managers and their vendor. And then you have the DEMDataSet, which has different ways that it's gotten. And then you have the EMSDataSet. Those 3 datasets make up the NEMSIS standard. Schematron validation rules can be applied to the EMS dataset and the demographic dataset. We only have one state currently that has a demographic dataset schematron, but it is possible to set up rules to make sure your agencies are sending in the information the way you want it for the demographics. For more information on each of the data set, it can be found on that guides and usage page that Lauri showed us earlier. But I did bring the infographic into the PowerPoint so you could see it as well. So the state data set represented by the Capitol building, and that is provided by your EMS data manager and their vendor. They work on that together. And that just lets your agencies know what the state expectations are in their software and what they should be collecting. The demographic data set, that's a snapshot of information about your provider agencies. Some states do create the demographics that are sent to the National Data Repository themselves on behalf of the agencies, and other states require the agencies to send those in. So like I said, there's different ways to get the demographic from the agency to the state and from the state to the NEMSIS TAC. And then it is important to know that you do need to have your demographic file in place before you send your EMS files. EMS is the other data set. This is your ePCR. This data set contains all of those E elements that could be collected in an ePCR environment. So a couple of quick facts for the state data set. We talked about how it's developed with the data manager and their vendor, and that it's specific information. This really, a good state data set really does help your vendors and your EMS provider agencies to know what the expectations are. That in conjunction with your schematron is going to give them the information they need to know. And it's a great way to open up communications with your agencies when you're listing your change logs and things like that. It is important to know as you're setting up your state data sets, they are optional. They do allow for not values. So if you are in a state that does not limit the scope of medications and procedures, and you don't want to include that in your state data set, you don't have to. It's nice so that your vendors and your agencies maybe know what codes you'd like associated with those medications and procedures when they are performed, but it's not required that you do that. The new thing for version 3.5 is state data sets are submitted via web services. They are no longer emailed into the system. They have to come directly through your receive and process vendor to the National Data Repository. Demographic data set, few quick facts. This is provided usually by an EMS provider agency, or the state can create it on behalf of them to send to the National Data Repository. It's a snapshot view, and the DEM data set for each submitting agency, again, I know you've heard this a couple times already today, cannot be said enough, is that at the national level, we require your demographic data set be submitted prior to accepting any of your ePCRs. There's some essential information within the demographic data set that identifies your agency. And it's super important for the information to match what's in your ePCR.
Yeah, I can speak to that real quick, Jen. I know often we will notice here that files have failed when they're sent from a state to us, and we kind of try to identify why it is they're failing. Often it's a missing DEM file, and so it may be a new agency that started submitting some files before they submitted a DEM. So it may be a timing issue or a missing DEM, or sometimes it's an incomplete DEM or information that's not matching between a DEM file and an EPCR or an EMS file. So for example, the agency 01 and 02, those agency numbers, and then also 04, the state, those need to match. And so if an EMS record has a different state listed than the demographic file associated with it, that'll cause it to fail. And so we can help you kind of troubleshoot if you have failing files, you're not sure why, but those are just kind of some common reasons that we see. They're missing DEM files or incomplete, or that information not matching between the DEM and the EMS file.
Yeah, and the data submission dashboard is just, if you haven't gotten onto it as an EMS data manager, or you don't have access yet, request the access. This is a great dashboard to take a look at to help troubleshoot some of those, especially as you begin your transition from 3.4 to 3.5. If the agency numbers change at all, or if they haven't submitted prior in 3.4, but they are going to start submitting in 3.5, right? There's different ways that could happen. On your report, I know on here it's blanked out, but it will show you which agencies, and it'll show you your agency ID with that. I love that report. I've gotten to know it very well since starting with the NEMSIS TAC. It's a great report. Some quick facts about the EMS data set. It contains the elements that can be included.
There's a question about if new DEMs are required with 3.5.
New demographic files are not required with 3.5. Although I will say it's a good opportunity if you haven't had your demographic files updated by your agencies in a while, it might be a good opportunity to get that information updated. It's just a good opportunity to maybe get that moving forward, but it is not a requirement. The EMS dataset contains there is a national schematron that applies to all of the EMS dataset XML files. There could also be the state or local EMS schematrons that applies. So you'll hear that a lot where we talk about the national validation rules versus the state validation rules. And that's because there can be two schematrons. And we will talk a little bit more about schematrons here shortly. And there is no need for a local or state schematron to repeat the national rules if the national rule is exactly the same. So something that I asked a lot when I first started trying to learn a lot of this, and what I hear from some of the newer data managers, is what exactly is a schematron? So the way I like to think about it is this is your file that has all your validation rules. And that's going to be applied to the submission of an EPCR, right? So it also helps inform your vendors of what needs to be in their software to make sure that the EMS clinicians are filling out the PCRs with all of the information that you want to have at the state level. If a state develops a state schematron, the EPCR will have the state schematron applied in addition to the national schematron. National schematron just was developed in collaboration with stakeholders to enhance the quality data collection. A really good example of that collaboration is on last year's annual meeting. We took back some of the warnings that we had seen on the schematron most often, and we talked about them with e-payment 01 firing on a consistent basis, which is the type of insurance, right? And then we found out, well, there's a lot of the EMS that are non-billable. The fire EMS usually is not a billable thing, so they don't record that information. So it's coming over as not recorded. It's getting a warning. So the discussion was had, do we really need that to be one of the national rules? And maybe that's something that should be, the states get to decide whether or not they collect that information. So that's a good example of the collaboration on how the national schematron is set up. The state schematrons are developed mostly by the state data managers. They get a lot of help from their state vendors. They might get informed. Sometimes they've set up a collaboration with some of their provider agencies to have discussions about the different rules that they're going to develop. And it's really nice when there's good communication about what is changing in that. Most receive and process vendors have created a front-end tool, so you don't have to learn how to read XML or SQL or anything like that. They've got nice point, click, and drags and things like that to help you create your schematron, which is really nice. Many of you might be familiar with your receive and process vendors front ends. More about the schematron. The National EMS Schematron, and everyone is tested on this as compliance, and compliance must be utilized by all NEMSIS compliant vendors for receive and process and collect and send when submitting EMS dataset files. EMS schematrons apply the validation rules to the EMS dataset. And again, we only have one state currently doing this, but more may do it in the future. Demographic schematrons can apply to the demographic dataset. A lot has been discussed with workforce and vehicle age and things like that. And that's all information that can be collected in the demographics. That's all decided pretty much at the state level. EMS provider agencies require the local state schematrons in order to submit data appropriately. So they need to have this in order to comply with your expectations as a state or local data manager. You need to tell them what the expectation is for them to be able to meet it. At the national level, records with warnings will be accepted, but records with errors will not be. Same goes for the state schematron. Mostly warnings will be accepted, errors will not be. State schematron warnings and errors do not need to duplicate the national warnings and errors. One of the things that we did was create a schematron checker report. And when you submit your schematrons, that usually will come back to you with, these may be some rules that you've duplicated between the national schematron and the state schematron. And the word may is important because it does take some human investigating. You might have a rule on the same element, but your rule's a little bit different. So for example, in the national schematron, e-response 05 type of service of requested is a mandatory, you must have a valid value in there. But you may have a rule that says if you have e-response 05 equal to inter-facility transport or hospital to hospital transport, you must have ECINE 13 hospital name or hospital code or something like that. So that may show up in your checker report because it's on the same element and they just want to make sure it's not duplicating. So that is a tool that we're sending to you when you send in your schematrons, just to give you an idea of where there may be duplication that's not necessary. And then, Lauri, did you want to talk about monitoring the warnings and helping the data managers with that?
Sure. Yeah, really, you can reach out to me if you're not familiar with this dashboard. I'd be happy to set up a call and show you what to look for on it or how you can sign up for subscriptions as well. But it is really helpful as it tells you how many files have failed that week. And then we can look at if there's any missing DEMS related to those files. So we probably don't have time right now, but on another training, or if you want to reach out to me, I'd be happy to do that. And then I see a few questions here. Why don't we circle back to those at the end, just in case people need to drop off at 10 or 11 o'clock my time. Why don't you finish the presentation, Jen? And then for anyone who has time, we'll stay on and answer all the questions. Does that sound okay?
That sounds great to me. And
Okay.
I do apologize for going long, guys. I'm sorry about that. So the next part is setting up the validation rules. And this is something that I used to once upon a time have lots of conversations about. I'm sure Lauri has a lot of conversations about now. Your vendors will call the state data managers, your EMS provider agencies will call the state data managers, talking about the validation rules. So here's just a few quick facts and a few things to think about as you're going through that process and working with your receive and process vendor to set them up. If an element is mandatory, and again, that's that usage from the data dictionary. If an element is mandatory, there is no need for additional state schematron rule that applies to having a value, right? National schematron always requires a value in this element. If an element is required, a validation rule within the state schematron may be utilized to require EMS clinicians to enter a value, but a not value will satisfy this rule. And then you have elements which are recommended. A validation rule within the state schematron can be created. It's important to remember that recommended elements do not have to be completed and allow for not values. An optional element can have a validation rule within the state schematron, but it does not allow for not values. And I say that way because we have seen in the past, sometimes rules will be set up around an optional element that requires the EMS clinician to enter a value, and there's no out for this clinician if they don't know the answer. So a good example of that would be E-Injury 08 airbag deployment, right? There's no, I don't know. And you don't want to set up your crews for failure. So let's say that your crew is on an intercept. So you have one crew that is taking the patient to another crew, and the handoff crew does not tell them about the airbag deployment, right? The receiving crew now has the patient, they're an MVC injury, and your state schematron includes a rule that says if it's an MVC, you must indicate which value from airbag deployment. Well, they don't know. They don't know if it was an old vehicle that had no airbags. They don't know if an airbag deployed, it just wasn't the one for their patient. They don't know that information. So if you require that in your schematron, you've set them up where they either have to falsify or they just can't transmit that PCR because they couldn't satisfy the rule. So that's why I say knowing your usage is super important as you start to set up your schematron rules. Other things to consider when you're making the rules is, will the EMS clinician always be able to answer the question if I've left them no out, or there's no unknown, or there's no none as a value that they can answer? Sometimes the states have taken away the ability to enter a not value in some elements. That's important. And I know there's times where they will always have this information, so maybe that's okay. But if you do that, make sure you've thought about whether the clinician can have that answer or not. Does this add to the quality of the documentation? Nice to have or must have? And the reason that's important to think about is because maybe it should be a warning instead of an error. You want the crews to think about it. You want it to flash on the screen. You want them to know that that's something they should be collecting. So you make it a warning and not an error. The other thing that I've seen some states do really successfully is they will start out with warnings, and they'll keep an eye on how often those warnings are coming through to their state repository. And then they may change it to an error later on down the road because they figured out that they need to enforce it a little more, or they found out that they're getting it whenever the crews can answer it. They are including that in their information. So those are just some things to think about as you're going through and you're making those rules, is how will it affect the EMS clinician? And that is it. Any questions? I know we have some that we're going to go over. Our contact information is on the screen. Please don't hesitate to reach out to the TAC. We are a resource for you, state data managers, for you vendors, for anyone who has any questions. It's nice to use the help desk because if anyone goes on vacation or they're out sick, that ticket would get routed to someone who could help you while they are out. So you may want to use the help desk on some things, or you are welcome to contact us directly.